Pascal, thanks for coming on. You're in Paris right now, correct?
Yes, that's correct. As you can see behind me,
Yeah, the beautiful view of the Eiffel
a beautiful
Tower.
closet.
Yeah, and it's probably filled with baguettes and cigarettes or something like that,
Yes,
right?
that is exactly what is inside there.
But really, what we want to do is talk to you about what you've seen, how everything looks on the ground, and also get some context for our listeners or viewers. Now, when
Sure.
we were talking before about originally recording this, you said you'd been doing quite a bit of rioting. So, how many cars have you been able to light on fire in the past week?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to beat my personal best. So my personal best is 12, which I achieved in 2005. And so I'm trying to get there. But I have to take it one at a time. So when this ends, I'll let you know what the final score is.
Okay, very good, very good. No, but really, just to prevent you from being arrested or something, you are not partaking in the rioting, and I suspect you disapprove of a lot of the property damage and that sort of thing.
I, in fact, disapprove of all of it.
Well, a lot of folks here in America will like walk past the TV and be like, "Oh, some cars are on fire in Paris," or "Oh, looks like a angry group of young men destroying a bank or something, or a supermarket." What started all of this? Because at this point, it's been going on for about a week. What started it? What was the actual issue, and what was sort of the underlying issue that made it blow up like this?
So the trigger was the trigger was the killing by police of a young man, a 17-year-old man named Nael, of a young man of Algerian origin. In and the As so often in those cases, the video clip that first emerged looked extremely damning to the cops. It looked like a traffic stop, and the cop shouting, "I'm gonna kill you," and then shooting him in the head, apparently for no reason. What later emerged was that there had been a chase, and this was the second time he had been stopped. Um, and the audio was sort of unclear. And there's today the France 2, which is the public news channel, reported that if you clean up the audio, it actually sounds what the cops are saying, turn off the engine, put your hands on your head, comply, and not, I'm going to shoot you. Um,
But this set off this killing. It's been compared to George Floyd. It set off. Let's just look at some numbers here about to give people a sense of the scale of what's happening, and then we can talk about sort of the underlying issue that drove this. You have in a country somewhere between the size of California and Texas, 70 million people, 45,000 police and other security forces being mobilized across the country, thousands of cars burned, perhaps 1,000 buildings burned or damaged. And these numbers are going down, but it's still not exactly progress when I think Sunday night it was 259 cars were burned instead of 1,000 a couple of days before. And you have 157 arrests, I think a total last night, more than 3,000 total. And I think the interior minister said the average age of the person being arrested is 17. And you're even having some incidents where a 12-year-old is setting a
yeah,
fire out there.
yeah, most of them are between 14 and 18.
Right. And a mayor's home is attacked. His family is fleeing in fear. This is some pretty serious chaos. What's driving this? Even if people had disinformation about the video or didn't understand the full story, why are these people so angry? Why are they taking to the streets like this?
Right. I mean, there's a sort of American thing, and I don't blame you guys. Oh, the French are rioting. It must be Tuesday. Um, and Again, I don't blame you. It's very embarrassing, but protest culture is part of the culture in France for a bunch of historical reasons we can go into. This is very different. It's a different demographic. Um, and it's basically the uh, Arab and African immigrant demographic in the well, it used to be the so-called banlieue, but really now it's everywhere. In part because of a law that was passed after the previous riots. Then it was thought.
the banlieues, for the people who don't speak French, that's sort of like a suburb, historically kind of marginalized groups or people separated from society were in the banlieues. But now you're saying it's not just in these like little segments, geographic segments, but throughout the country.
Yes. So small towns, peaceful small towns were attacked. This is one of the things that were new, that's new. So the last big uh, riots were in 2005, but they were big, but they were localized. Here you had people burn things down in the center of Paris, in the center of Brest, in the center of everywhere, and all, well, not everywhere, but like major cities. Anyhow, and you had small towns and places like that also getting attacked. So this is also another way in which this is much bigger, and it's not a protest. There's no demand. It's not being organized by, or if it is, not officially. um and um and it is much more violent. Like French protests can sometimes turn violent, but it's a sort of controlled violence, and historically they're sort of, they're peaceful protests. Like my parents, they didn't go to protest because they were, conservative. But like they knew people who did, and it was like a festive event you went to with your friends, and like you had a barbecue afterwards. This is not that.
Yeah, I remember when I was living in Paris, I it was during the first Macron pension reform push, and they had shut down all of the trains, and there were regular protests. And I remember walking near Republique, where there are so many protests historically in France. There was a line of about 12 police vans, and there were riot police inside of them eating their dinner before the protesting began. And I remember there was one cop walking down to each van and giving them a bunch of baguettes to go with their dinner, and it all just seemed very normal and planned. And like you said, and maybe a car would get lit on fire, maybe there'd be some some clashes between the protesters, but it, like you said, it didn't. Typically in pension reform, we know the French feel very strongly about that, but it didn't really spiral into violence.
Yes.
It seems
Yes,
like,
that's a good example, because the protests themselves were very big and very recent, but the violence was very limited.
and one sort of difficulty with this, and it's something I learned while I was living there, and I've spoken to lots of French about, and there's sort of a debate within France about this, is color blindness is sort of enshrined in French political life and social cultural life, where there are no hyphenated Frenchmen. You're not in the same way that we have African Americans or Mexican Americans or Asian Americans. That's not something that's really kosher in France. Um, what how does that affect this debate and these groups, even if these young people out there on the street aren't making any demands? Clearly there is a racial or ethnic element to what's happening here. How to explain that concept and that debate, and how people think about that in France?
Yeah, I mean, the issue there is, this issue of color blindness is, that has been historically the French position, and a sort of consensus across the political spectrum, but less and less so. And there is a sort of neo-colonial, there's a sort of colonial resentment element. So, the people who came here are people from former French colonies, and they don't consider themselves French. Like, Le Monde did an article, once. It was very controversial, but they did an article about anti-white racism in the banlieue, and in that world, the term français, so French, is a racial slur. So, and the article had a very touching, very sad story about the well-meaning teacher, like explaining to Ibrahim or whatever, no, no, you're French too. You're a citizen of France, this country of human rights. And he was saying, stop insulting me, like stop calling me white, because to them the word français is a slur for a white person. That's the meaning of the word, and so they do not recognize themselves as belonging to the French community, and they're hostile to it. There's a sort of noxious mixture of Islamism and the ideology of young people in the banlieue, which, and you would think those two things are complete opposites, right? Except they have a few things in common, which is number one, this sort of like over the top masculinity, uh, comfort with violence, and three, just sort of opposition to everything you would regard as French.
Now, I want to talk about the political angle, but there's also a tremendous hostility on behalf of the police toward the people that they say that they're at war with. You have police unions putting out statements saying we're dealing with savage hordes. Some of them are using the word vermin, right? They're not holding back. They're not too worried about political correctness, the French police unions. This kind of rhetoric suggests that they're feeling abandoned by President Macron, who, if I recall, immediately condemned or at least made comments about the video shortly after it was released, saying this was unacceptable or unjustified. Um, Explain to me the French political reaction, because kind of we're describing these seemingly intractable social dynamics, but across the spectrum, what are French politicians doing? How are they responding? Maybe we can start with the president himself.
Yeah. So you're right. The first reaction from Macron was to blame the cop. The French National Assembly held a minute silence for Naël. The cop was thrown in preventive detention, which is not going beyond what the law would normally do for somebody who's only suspected. He hasn't been formally charged with anything, and he's presumed innocent until a court renders a judgment, but he's been thrown in jail anyway. Um, and and the minute silence was very offensive to some people because the National Assembly refused to have a minute silence for Lola, who was this little 12-year-old girl who was sexually assaulted and butchered by an Algerian illegal immigrant several months ago, and she was a cause célèbre, and the national rally tried to have the National Assembly have a minute silence for her, and they refused. Um, so that's how it started for Macron. That's where his reflexes are, and then as the violence sort of got bigger and bigger, he held a very bizarre, frankly, press conference where he blamed the violence on social networks and video games, and said that the answer was to ban people who shared those violent videos on social networks. Uh,
Seems a bit insufficient,
Well,
given
and
the
the
gravity of the
sad
problem.
thing is that it's probably smart politics because his electoral base are well-off people above who are over 60, and a lot of them probably do think that the cause of violence is social networks and video games. Um, but I agree that given the scale of the civic violence, it's somewhat underwhelming.
And how in the U.S. we always divide. I'm thinking about the George Floyd riots. The fault lines were drawn the post George Floyd riots throughout the summer of 2020. Very quickly, you had a dividing line in American politics. Macron is sort of a weird figure in terms of confounding left and right, often sort of bouncing between the two. But in the traditional left, I'm thinking Jean-Luc Mélenchon, guys like that. How are they responding to this? And we could talk about the right in a second. But are there any significant French political figures who are, if not defending, at least excusing or saying, no, this is understandable, this is the cry of the oppressed, that sort of thing?
Oh, so the Mélenchon and his acolytes. Like the story of Mélenchon could be, like a book or a novel because he's a philosophy professor who used to be a man of the traditional Enlightenment left. He he said things like race doesn't exist. It's not true to say that France was a colonial oppressor. because his parents were working class whites in Algeria, and it's true, like the poor white people in Algeria, French colonists, were very poor, and like poorer than poor white people in France. Um, uh, and he has completely, you know, transformed into this race baiter, gone from this very secular figure to this quasi-Islamist figure, because his that's that's his electoral base. That's the electoral base of the far left in France now. It's the so-called Islamo-leftism. And so he has been, he has explicitly said, "I will not call for peace." He tweeted that sentence, and several of his, elected said, no peace but justice, and like, posting clips of Martin Luther King saying riots are the language of the unheard, and all that stuff. I mean, it's really, if you want to talk about insurrections and like supporting insurrections, I mean, it's very, very frightening. And from my perspective, just completely unconscionable.
And on the right, you mentioned before National Rally seeking
Yeah,
that the National Rally Party is led by not anymore, but for quite some time by the Le Pen
yeah,
family, who many of our listeners are certainly familiar with, who've looked at the right, the far right. I'm always uncomfortable because it's such a grab bag of politics, but generally considered on the right
yes.
in some fashion, despite
They're populist right.
right. And they clearly have taken an anti-immigrant stance in the
Yeah,
past, and with people not necessarily entering French society in ways, and like you said, remaining apart, not considering themselves French, whatever their passport says. Um, what's interesting to me about Le Pen is she had steadily gained more and more support over years,
yeah,
from being this rare fringe party that shocked
yeah,
France by making it to a runoff 20 years ago to
yeah,
she still lost fairly decisively to Macron last year,
yeah.
but but she gained quite a bit of support and a large chunk.
Yeah, she has a bloc that's basically 40% of the country that will vote for
Right.
her no matter what.
It, could you see a scenario where some of these voices who had once been considered fringe, and while some people might consider her policies fringe, she politically her support is not necessarily fringe anymore. Like you said, a very large chunk of the country is willing to support her, even look past things that they may find not to their liking. Is this the kind of thing that changes French political culture and resets people's perceptions and what they might allow? I know we're still 4 years out from the next presidential election, but how does this affect French politics and the right in France?
I'm honestly curious. I don't really know. My general sense is, and this is very cynical, is that everybody has made up their mind a long time ago, and they believe what they believe. And like, if you want to believe that the riots are just like a under sad but understandable response to, systemic racism, or if you want to believe that the riots are, you know yet another example of the errors of mass immigration, you're going to believe that. And if you believe, I just don't want to think too hard about these issues, which is probably the position of many people, uh, unless it's literally your car that's getting burned. Um, uh, I may be wrong about that, because they are an order of magnitude larger. They are more geographically spread. So my joke about it being literally your car that's getting burnt is less of a joke. uh, but um, I mean, the short answer is that politically, of course, it's good for the national rally, and it's bad for Macron because it happened under his watch, and for 2 or 3 days he just sort of watched it happen. Um, so all else equal, yes, but is it gonna like completely shift French politics, instead of like moving Le Pen up by 2 points and Macron down by 2 points. Uh, I wouldn't bet on it. I mean, anything's possible, but I wouldn't bet on it. The ones who really beclown themselves are the so-called Republicans, who are the moderate center right party, who is now a rump, but like ruled France for 40 years, and they um, they essentially talked about how this was like the product of systemic racism and how the answer was to spend more money on the banlieue, which is, regardless of the merits, the exact opposite of what their voters, or in most cases, former voters, believe. So, you understand why it went from, the default party of government in France to a party that's got like 20 members of parliament.
The This is sort of a pretty common trend throughout Europe. You see it in Spain with people going from Partido Popular to Vox, where there are people who traditionally were always voting for the center right, but things get bad in one way or another, and they're starting to consider it's like, yeah, national rally, kind of some anti-Semitism here and there, but man, those riots are bad, and I guess we'll roll the dice. I guess the last question is there anything else? But my last question for you is there, and maybe this is just my American problem solution mentality, but legislatively, is there anything coming? I understand now it's about restoring order and dealing with the security situation, but in the wake of this, do you see any legislation moving through the National Assembly? I know it's tricky because Macron doesn't have a majority, but what could possibly be done, or is there any solution, or is this just one of those intractable societal conflicts that we have to wait and see, and we don't know?
I mean, so in terms of what will happen, they've already said they're going to spend more money on the banlieue, so that's going to be coming in the National Assembly. In terms of what could be done, I mean, burning cars is already illegal in France, so the problem is not the law. Burning down somebody's house is already, Um, and in terms of immigration law, I mean, this is one of the problems with the French debate around immigration is there's nothing legislation can do because most of it is written either by courts or by EU treaties, and so um, there is nothing the legislator can do. One reason why immigration has been so bad in France is that most of it is done through what's known in the U.S. as chain migration. So you bring over somebody from your relative, and they can bring over their relative, and so on. Which means there's no like criteria for do you have a degree? Are you not an Islamic radical? Zero, none. Most of the people coming here are coming here through chain migration, and chain migration has been entrenched as a constitutional right by the Conseil d'État on with no textual basis, like literally none. Um, and so you would have to. This is why the main demand of those sort of right wing parties is a referendum on immigration, because a referendum would allow to amend the constitution, which is the only way to go over to overturn a Supreme Court decision.
And how do you
Um,
get a referendum in France? What are is that does it start in the legislature, or how do you?
So there's two ways. There's Article 11 of the Constitution where the president does it, and then there's Article 89 where there has to be a vote by the Parliament and then a referendum.
It doesn't sound like Macron is eager to hold a referendum on immigration, or maybe he is. I don't know.
I mean, he definitely isn't.
Okay.
If he did, he would become the most popular politician in in my lifetime. Certainly, he would become the most popular French politician. I mean, it's one of the mysteries of the age we live in. It's that politicians could do all these things, which whether or not they would be good or bad, they would be extremely popular. And politicians are supposed to want to be more popular, and they won't do them. So if Macron changed nothing about his agenda and just became very anti-immigration, or not even very anti-immigration, just, let's stop family migration from Africa, just that, uh, he would like double his approval ratings at least.
Pascal, thanks for your time.
Thank you.